So, I recently saw the Demonslayer Infinity Castle movie, and I gotta tell you, I was impressed. The movie itself is pretty fine, but the truth is, I'm way more impressed with the way that the film presents the idea of a dungeon itself. It's something I've wanted to talk about for a long time, but this film tackles dungeons and a dungeon crawling adventure in a really intriguing way. And the more I watched the movie, I realized this might be the best dungeon I've seen in the last 10 years. And there's honestly a ton I think we as game masters can learn from its design. And then I figured, if I can break down several hundred years of medieval and Bronze Age history, I can break down why you need to make a dungeon like Demonslayer. So buckle up, buckaroos, step into the time machine because we're going to Taisho era Japan! But first, a recap for the uninitiated, and spoilers, obviously, for the Demonslayer Infinity Castle movie. So, Demonslayer takes place in Japan during its Taisho period, in the years 1912 to 1926. If we're being honest, this time period probably deserves its own video because it's a really intriguing blend of how Japan's early tradition clashed and eventually combined with a rapidly westernizing world. It's a really interesting time period in its history, and one that makes for a lot of cool little set-piece moments within the show. But our story follows Tanjiro Kamado and his friends as they attempt to slay the demon lord, Muzan Kibutsuji, and lift the curse of demonhood placed on his sister, Nezuko. To help him in this, he winds up joining the Demonslayer Corps, a paramilitary group of men and women who hunt demons in the shadows. This group is led by people called Hashira, who are elite warriors who gained that rank by developing special martial arts techniques and slaying multiple powerful demons, usually in conjunction with one another, but sometimes on their own. Behind the scenes and in the shadows is the wealthy and mysterious Ubuyashiki family, who has been bankrolling all of the organization's endeavors, paying for training, equipment, upkeep, and transportation, and all attempting to bring order to a Japan that doesn't even realize it's at war within its borders. They're opposed by the aforementioned Muzan Kibutsuji, a villain whose incompetence is matched only by his resemblance to Michael Jackson. Shimon! Muzan can make demons by powering them with his blood, and if a demon lives long enough, it gets powerful enough to develop something called a blood demon art, which is a technique that winds up being as unique and individual as the demon itself. A lot of the really bad, awful, terrible traits that the demons have get amplified once they're transformed. Over time, Muzan has built his answer to the Hashira with the 12 Kizuki. They're demons who have lived long enough and have consumed enough humans to develop especially powerful techniques and powerful blood demon arts. They're kind of like his lieutenants and sub-commanders in the war against humanity. While attempting to finally destroy Muzan, Nakime, one of the 12 Kizuki, activates her blood art and teleports the entirety of the Demonslayer Corps into the Infinity Castle, a pocket dimension fortress that she controls using her blood art. Muzan uses this as a base of operations and as a kind of mobile troop carrier, using it to teleport demons and spit them out wherever Nakime teleports them. It is in this ever-changing fortress that the main characters find themselves in as they attempt to hunt Muzan down, while Muzan is also attempting to destroy each and every one of them. And that's pretty much all you need to know to break down what we're doing now. I'm going to break down this movie into lessons that I think help us make compelling dungeons, some takeaways that I thought were incredibly strong within this narrative, and as always, if you're a fan of how we've been doing the last couple videos on organizations, on religion, and warfare, we will actually be creating our own dungeon throughout using the lessons that I think you can take from the film. So with that out of the way, it's time to slay. The most important lesson, and the one I think is the most interesting, at least to me, is that the dungeon itself is hostile. Usually, when we are talking about hostility in a dungeon, a fantasy dungeon, what people are referring to are things like traps or sometimes environmental hazards. My issue with this is somebody who loves both believability and when the gameplay of something lines up with the world building and the lore, is that traps don't really make a ton of sense. They're expensive to maintain, they require a great deal of expertise to create in the first place, and something that we don't think about is you would have to continually bring an expert back to help you maintain the traps that keep the space quote-unquote safe. This is a big issue because usually a dungeon is built to hide or protect something. And in that regard, secrecy is its best weapon. And so a lot of times when I'm reading or playing through an adventure that has like a ton of these traps, they don't make a lot of sense, at least in game world. And it's something I struggle with because I loved Indiana Jones, and I love it when we get some Rube Goldberg-esque death machines that are running around. And this is one of the things that the Infinity Castle does beautifully, and it makes sense within the story. Part of the thing that's cool about it is because it's tied to a character's blood demon art, it makes sense within that world. It's a power, not necessarily just a static building. But what I love is the hostility, the traps, if you will, the environmental hazards, are all baked into how the castle functions. In the beginning, all of the Demon Slayers are lured into this space and then dropped into the transdimensional castle, some of whom actually don't make it because they get vibe checked by gravity on the way down. This happens multiple times in the film where the floor will open up mid-fight, causing them to tumble around. Another thing that I think is really intriguing is because it is an ever-expanding space built on the character's imagination and personal power, it makes it really difficult for the characters to group up and use their numbers and experience to their advantage. The space is literally so vast, and it's constantly expanding and changing, making it very difficult to coordinate. Another thing that I think is really interesting is that walls will continually shift or form. Roofs will sprout out of nowhere. As we mentioned, floors will drop in and out, and staircases will shift, making it even more difficult to coordinate even if you do get with somebody, or in some cases making it possible to have a limb trapped, a part of your body crushed, or at the very least having an attack negated because what was going to be a clean strike has now been interrupted by a fancy looking banister. Another thing that I think is absolutely intriguing is the way that this space plays around with gravity. Because we are in a trans-dimensional area, we're in a spot outside of the existing rules and physics of our world, it can play around fast and loose with gravity, making for not just really challenging and interesting traps, but changing the rules for how combat can function, usually to the detriment of the heroes. But again, it's like fighting inside of an insane, demented M.C. Escher painting, and I kind of love that. Instead of something like a pit trap, the hostility of the space is itself a defensive and offensive mechanism of the monsters that are there. And it's this hostility that I think is really interesting if we're going to make a dungeon. And let's talk a little bit about our dungeon. When I say that I love the hostility of this space, what I mean is I love that its defensive and offensive capabilities are baked into what the story of that space is and what those characters are trying to do. And I thought about a couple different ways that we could make this work. I'm going to give some rare praise to Magic the Gathering here because its world of Zendikar is kind of one big giant dungeon. Environmental hazards provide a lot of intriguing and interesting difficulties for players to overcome, and these environmental hazards surround the tombs of the Eldrazi, ancient interdimensional beings whose very presence changes the laws of physics. And because these are essentially not just tombs, but they're compounds, they're prisons, and they're temples, because over time people have forgotten the original story and begun to worship those Eldrazi as gods. They have all kinds of local flora and fauna around them because they're based with the environment too. All of those factors make them really compelling and very interesting dungeon-like megaplexes. However, it's spooky season, and I kind of wanted to riff on some of my favorite films like Hill House or things like The Haunted Mansion a la Disney, and I thought, what better way to do a cool hostile dungeon than by doing a little bit of a haunted house. So allow me to introduce to you, my friends, Ashcroft Manor. You see, Byron Ashcroft was many things in his life: a captain of industry, a military officer of great repute, and by the end of it, a powerful and greedy man. Byron's one regret in life was that he absolutely, positively despised his children. He thought of them not just as parasites, worming their way through his fortune with little to show for their own personal accomplishments, but he despised how they acted. In many ways, they were his greatest disappointment. Byron did not like their foppishness, their excess, and ultimately, he hated the idea that everything of his legacy would go to them. So he decided to do something about it. Byron threw a massive masquerade ball, a Halloween feast for the ages, and at the zenith of it, made sure that everything and everyone was poisoned. And so, over the years, Ashcroft Manor has become rife with the ghosts of those partygoers, but specifically the ghost of Byron Ashcroft's deceased family. During that time, all of the negative emotions have begun to fester, and the ghosts and specters that haunt that place have begun to bend it to their will, working whatever their last desires were into the floorboards themselves. This isn't just a house. This is a psychic and emotional sinkhole. This is a place where reality meets the afterlife, and it's all at the whims of a bunch of rich, entitled, aristocratic ghosts. And that is where we are going to look at our map. You see, not only is this a sprawling mansion, but just like Byron's original inheritance, his family couldn't bear to share, and so his 4 prominent children have each split the manor apart into their own personal domiciles. We have Myron Ashcroft, who was a very, very timid man, but his power is that he can shrink things. He can cause rooms, objects, even the players to shrink in size. He is met, of course, by Willem Ashcroft, his brother, who is able to cause parts of things, or even entire objects and rooms, to swell to enormous proportions, which could be very interesting if a player suddenly finds themselves lost in a very cavernous space. Wilhelmina Ashcroft, the oft-forgotten middle daughter, is actually, in a way that sort of echoes her life, able to make things intangible, kind of like how she was invisible in her own existence. And Jane Ashcroft, the youngest of the family, is able to switch the players and abilities whenever she likes. She's also able to switch the properties of physical objects within the area of her domain. This means that you can play fast and loose with things like weight, which is very interesting if a player thinks a fast-acting dagger is going to do well when it suddenly weighs as much as a baby grand piano. All of these things allow us to play around fast and loose with the actual layout of the mansion. These ghosts can add or change or alter their physical spaces in ways that make sense, quote unquote, for the way that they lived their lives and in accordance with their personalities, which means that this is a mansion that can grow in size even though it will look the same on the outside. This is a psychic and emotional sinkhole, remember that. And because each ghost has its own rules, the players are going to have to tread lightly before interacting with the space and the monsters therein. And actually brings me to the second lesson that I really think we can take from the Demonslayer castle, which is that the dungeon's layout and the challenges within it are connected with the narrative and with the overarching goal. One of the things that comes up often is like the presence of monsters in weird locations. I find even in quote-unquote well-designed dungeons that this is an issue. I'm all for the random orc tribe showing up, but I love when the orc tribe shows up and it makes sense within the environmental storytelling of the space that the dungeon is in. And this is another big victory for the Infinity Castle. Those pockets of random demons aren't just there to be random, they're part of a larger strategy by Muzan and his organization to wear the Demonslayer core down. In fact, throughout the movie, some of the Slayers remark that these demons seem freshly formed and newly birthed, which means he's essentially been preparing these pockets of lesser fodder enemies to have for this occasion. It adds a lot of weight and verisimilitude to the idea that there's just thousands of random mobs running around, and I like that. I like when a story attempts to try to justify the existence of its chaff characters, so to speak. Or the idea of a random boss fight just sort of thrown into the middle makes tons of sense in the Demon Castle because these are Muzan's shooters. These are his boys. They are there to spin the block on the Demonslayer core. They're his bodyguards and they're his #1 destroyers. So of course that they're in those spaces and they're away and isolated from the fodder demons who would simply get in the way when they're battling the Hashira and the main characters. So their separation from those lower level monsters makes sense both within the context of the greater narrative and within the context of the story. And the other thing that I love that Demonslayer's Infinity Castle does beautifully is its use of set piece rooms. Usually they suck in most dungeons, especially if a dungeon is trying to be designed to be quote unquote historically accurate or historically inspired. One of the things that happens is you'll often wind up with these big sort of pillared rooms like this, and there's no shade here. I myself have drawn and made many a pillared room in my storied RPG career, but again, once you start studying dungeon layout or medieval history in general like I do, you start to realize these just don't make a ton of sense, and most actual dungeons, like this map of one of the pyramids for example, don't have those rooms. Their strength, not just is in their anonymity, but in their difficulty to navigate. So narrow corridors with steep angles that intertwine on themselves to confuse would-be tomb robbers is the order of the day, which makes for, great and truthful story design if you're making a real dungeon, but doesn't exactly make for the kind of bombastic game experience that myself and many gamers seem to enjoy. And this is where Demonslayer picks up another win. Of course there are big set piece locations, because where do you think the 12 Kizuki reside? These are not lesser demons. These are important members of Muzan's organization. They're going to ball out when it comes to their homes. This one, for example, is a floating pagoda temple dedicated to one of the 12 Kizuki, who in human life was a cult leader, so of course his space looks like a temple. Akaza, who was, in his human life, a renowned and deadly martial artist, his space looks like a multi-tiered dojo, because of course it does. This allows for the space to have incredibly evocative and visually interesting locations for these games, or for the battles, I should say, and I think it's something that we can take for our games, right? But finally, the most important thing is the way that the story and the dungeon layout puts the whole thing on a timer. The Demonslayers are gunning for two individuals. They're looking for Nakime, because if they take Nakime out, then they're no longer at the whims and the mercy of an ever-shifting location like the Infinity Castle, and if they take Muzan out, all of the demons just fall to the ground instantly. So they have a goal. However, because Nakime is constantly manipulating the space, and because it's filled with lesser fodder, the players, or the Demonslayers in this case, can't afford to take a nice long rest to recover and recuperate. They have to continue to push, because the second they try to take a rest, they'll find themselves crushed by a staircase or overwhelmed by sheer numbers. They're not necessarily outgunned, but they are definitely outnumbered, and the environment provides an advantage to those large numbers. Similarly, because everything seems hostile, it presents a puzzle for the characters to solve, but most of all, this conflict and the time limit imposed on it feels earned. It's not arbitrary. It's there because both sides have time-sensitive goals. Muzan was weakened in the ambush, so this is the time that we can take him out. Muzan has all of the Demonslayers in one place. This is the time that we can take them out. The Demonslayers have deployed the Hashira. The members of the Kizuki have been weakened throughout the series. There's lots of them dead, and unfortunately, there's only a large number of fodder demons to sort of support things. Both sides are on a time crunch, and it makes the entire experience better. We have to eliminate the high-value targets, and we have to do it in a short amount of time. And if you want to think about how we can address this for our games, we can set up awesome set-piece locations for the individual specters. For example, Myron Ashcroft could set up in the kennels, the places he fled to, and he can have horrifying spectral hounds that support him in combat, or harry the players as they float through walls, nipping at their heels and damaging them before fading back into obscurity with a terrifying howl as they go back into the stonework. Or what about our friend Willem, the gluttonous one? Why not set him up in an incredible wine tasting room, a gallery of seemingly endless extravagance and luxuries, populated by elementals of pure wine and congealed food, literal extensions of his own vices? Or how about our transparent friend, the one who wants to blend into the background, Wilhelmina? We could put her in the actual stately greenhouse, or perhaps there's a giant glass dome at the top of the mansion that she can be based in, a place as transparent and invisible to the naked eye as she felt that she was in life. And again, you could do cool stuff with mirror enemies too, or perhaps maybe make the players have to traverse a two-dimensional plane as they get sucked into the reflections. There's a lot you can do with a space like that that makes it cool within the story. And Jane Ashcroft, with her constant habit of disguising as as her siblings or as other important people, why not set it up in a giant dressing room, something, a mix between Haunted Mansion, a Macy's, and the single most demented, Mad Max set piece you've ever seen. I want murderous ghost mannequins, gosh darn it. Why not have them wear magical clothing? And maybe the players have to decide between damaging the mannequins or maybe trying to subdue the mannequins to get the magical clothing off of them, because it's expensive and potentially useful for the players in future adventures. All of those set pieces become available to us. And as the game master, we can play around with the way that this world is set up, because we've already established that this is a place unbound from reality and shaped by the psychic force and desires, the trauma of the specters that lie therein. And this brings us into our third and final lesson. Just like the Demonslayer castle, a good dungeon, a great dungeon, should focus the player into strategic push and pull. And this is where we get to talk about the time limit that we're imposing on our players in the Ashcroft Manor. But first, let's talk about how that push and pull works in the context of Demonslayer. Muzan is weakened. Muzan cannot flee. He uses the Infinity Castle to get around, but we have pursued him into the Infinity Castle, which presents an incredible opportunity. And so, what is Muzan's response? It's activate the 12 Kizuki, bring in a bunch of lesser demons, and try to beat them. The response is the Hashira begin to group up and coordinate to help take the fight directly to Muzan, who again is weakened and is far less of a threat than he was before. In order to negate the effect of the Hashira, however, Muzan makes those pockets of lesser demons, demons that they weren't even aware of when they first arrived in the location to start with. All of these new demons are designed, as we mentioned, to wear the Hashira down, to tax their stamina, their resources, or potentially catch them slipping up. These demons continue to provide roadblocks to the stronger characters so they can't just get to Muzan, and he has got the time that he needs to either coordinate a counteroffensive or heal up enough that he's the threat that they all know him to be. How do the players, or in this case the Demonslayers, respond? Well, that's easy. They start to rely on the lesser Demonslayers that they brought with them. Usually, the characters of the show try to protect the lesser members of the core because that's what they want. They want to foster a sense of growth. But in this case, it's a cool story moment that many of those lesser unnamed characters that we've seen in the background start to step up and fight for themselves, and in some cases fight to relieve the Hashira of their duties so that they can go after the high value targets. It's played up as an inspirational moment, and it is in the story, but it's a great strategic response. We have spent all season trying to train up the weaker people, and now those weaker people get a chance to shine and do so by removing a tactical roadblock. Okay, what's the next response? Well, if the lesser people are going to start fighting, we'll expand the Infinity Castle. Let's try to use that as a way to actually break up these newly formed squadrons and make it harder, even with the rank and file, to actually get to Muzan or take out the Kizuki. How do we respond? We use the crows that they have to communicate with one another throughout the series, we combine it with some of the tactics, and we attempt to map out the Infinity Castle as it changes. While the castle is ever expanding, it's still attached to Nakime, and thus is still subject to mortal patterns and mortal vices, which means that certain singularities and commonalities start to emerge, making this map actually incredibly helpful while the Demon Slayers attempt to do it. And this is cool, by the way, we'll talk about this in a little bit with MacGyvering, but this is exactly the kind of creative problem solving that you want your players to engage in a dungeon space like this. We're taking two things that have been mentioned in the show prior, and we're using them in brand new exciting ways to make it so that the players, or in this case the Slayers, have a chance to fight back. So what's the next response? Well, the Hashiras decide to group up using that information to take the fight to the enemy. What's the response to that? instead of waiting for the Hashira to find them, the Kizuki actually start going out and hunting them themselves, removing some of the tactical advantage of them knowing the locations. All of this strategic push and pull is done for the effect of the narrative, but it makes for really engaging combat and storytelling, and it's this kind of push and pull that I think you should take and put into your dungeons, and that ties into what our ghosts want. This push and pull is exactly what we're going to be working with here. The ghosts are eternally trapped in Ashcroft Manor. However, like most rapacious and rich folk, they want more, and they've realized, even though that they are, gone from the mortal plane and they're bound to Ashcroft Manor, there's nothing stopping them from expanding the manor. And how do they do that? The more lives that the Ashcroft siblings claim, the more additions to the manor there are. Literally, as they consume lives and souls, the manor grows bigger, thus expanding their domiciles, which means they're not just competing with the players, they're competing with each other to get the players to be destroyed in their domains, so that part of the mansion expands. This means there's tons of room for different strategic push and pull. If the players know or figure out that they are a useful and valuable commodity to the Ashcroft siblings, they might actually use some negotiation to turn those siblings against each other. Why not work with one of the Ashcroft siblings to gain dominion in the mansion? After all, they're rich, they're petty, and they've been bound by several hundred years of daddy issues and horrible interpersonal drama. You might be able to convince some of the ghosts to lend you their power if it means you can go after their siblings, and a savvy negotiation-focused player might notice that. What about research? The Ashcroft Manor was a large, stately, and well-appointed home. Chances are it has all manner of new knowledge, some of which might have been knowledge that's lost forever, and much of which might be knowledge that could help the players destroy and overwhelm the Ashcroft siblings themselves. Who knows? If you have a good note-taker in your party, why not give them the opportunity to go through the Ashcroft Manor or the Ashcroft accounts to find useful information that they could use to help destroy the specters once and for all. What about magic? We've already established this is a psychically driven place, a sinkhole of personality and struggle, so there's tons of opportunities for some ghost magic. Perhaps a player actually winds up getting in good with some of the lesser ghosts and manages to lead a magic ghost revolt. I want to see a magic ghost butler punch their magical ghost boss in the magical ghost face. Don't you? That sounds cool. Yay, class struggle. Or what about fighting? We already mentioned the mannequins that might be possessed in Jane Ashcroft's strange dressing room, but there's all manner of creepy crawly things that a physically minded character could battle against. Or perhaps using this strategy of MacGyvering, you make a set of ghost brass knuckles so you can punch the ghost in the face. MacGyvering is my favorite part about a space like this, because once you've established that the rules are a little wibbly wobbly, your players can do anything. Who's to say that your players don't use magic and scraps that they find within the space to turn a carriage into an actual ghost catching machine? Who's to say that the players don't stuff precious childhood mementos into a lantern and then use that to lure the ghosts into each other's domains where their reality warping powers don't work quite as well or don't work at all, essentially turning a simple piece of artifact into, I don't know, some kind of spectral super pinata. Who's to say that the players don't channel the rage of all of the lesser ghosts who have been trapped there, all the victims of the Ashcroft family and their avarice, their violence, their greed, and then turn them into some sort of psychic weapon to rend the mansion asunder? All of these are potential possibilities, and again, I think this does a pretty good job of illustrating some of the lessons that we learned from the Infinity Castle. And with that, my friends, this brings episode 1 of Things You Should Steal from Pop Culture to a close. If you have liked this particular video, please consider backing our Patreon. For $10 a month, you get your own unique role-playing game that you can't get anywhere else. It's really, really helpful. It lets me do cool stuff like this all of the time. But you can get physical copies that are already in circulation from our friends over at Tabletop Bookshelf or Indie Press Revolution. You can also get digital copies over at itch.io. All of our PDFs are there if you like to have your stuff all in one place. But with that out of the way, I have to thank my amazing patrons Dionysus, Chris Spates, Agile Monk, Kavadi, Alex.vksh, Solution, Stefan Brissot, Brian, Gorbino the Great, Papa Dinosaur, Chromatic Orbital Strike, Chris Mayer, Darth, Arcane Bard, Commander Unidentified, Darjeeling Trailblazer, Carl Agius, David Z, Michael Torres, Vitalath, and Viralder, and I have to thank our amazing YouTube members, Ro.kn, Gaming Gambison, Agile Monk, Joshua Williams, Green, Artemis, Marcus Miller, Samuel Putnam, Lorenzo Buck, Seralder, and Chandler Dwyer. Without your help, making these videos would be a far more daunting and difficult process, one that I think even storming Ashcroft Manor would make easy by proxy. And with that out of the way, folks, thank you all so much for watching this video. You have all been absolutely amazing. I'm Kyle Ott for Desks and Dorks, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.